Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today evening a conversation on a very interesting topic, which is the empathy algorithm, decoding the power of humanity in a digital world. And we are so privileged today that we are joined by our lovely guest today, Mimi Nickle, who is an empathy advocate, author, CEO, wears multiple hats, runs programs around the world. In fact, she has the goal of reconnecting 1 million people in empathy everywhere around the globe. She's an internationally acclaimed best selling author and multi award winning founder of the world's widest reaching empathy training and engagement platform. She's also ranked number one workplace well-being leader in Malaysia on LinkedIn by Fevicon. She is also a top five rated podcast host of her own show, which is Mimi Yu, and she is omnipresent in the media, appearing live on BBC to 85 million people. She also recently appeared on stage with Bill Gates. She's an experienced executive coach, mentor, and a global thought leader, advocating the movement to create more empathy around the world in personal and professional life. She has trained more than 20,000 plus professionals in various Fortune 500 companies around the world. And she was also recently awarded Malaysian Female Leader 2024 and Top 45 Sri Lankan Leader in 2024. She specializes in listening led, empathetic leadership, multi generational engagement, psychological safety, inclusion, and well being. With this, a very warm welcome to you, Mimi. We are so privileged and honored to have you with us today, this evening.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Every time I hear that bio, I think, did I really do all of those things? So thank you. Thank you for reminding me on a Friday of all the things I've been up to. And it's absolutely a pleasure to be here with all of you.
We are also equally privileged because, some of these topics, when you talk about, empathy, inclusion, somebody like me who is an engineer, these are very heavy words, and we sort of look at some of these things, hear about them, but I don't think most of us, even though we run our companies, truly understand what they mean.
Mm.
And I was reading, about you, and I mean, you're all over the media when this topic comes up, and I was reading something about you, and I think it's very powerful, and I just wanted to share it with everyone because I think it also sort of sets the context for our conversation today.
Mm.
I was reading two different statements which you made in one of the forums you were at. One was that empathy is not just a soft skill, because many of us categorize, label it that, oh, soft skills training is going on. All the technical skills. Like, I come from tech and AI background, so we always do these things like, okay, something tick in the box in the organization. Let's do what's left. DEI is done. Posh is done. Let's do something around empathy and how we can be an empathetic. But you make a very compelling case that it's not just a soft skill, but it's like a strategic imperative, and it's a real business advantage. And
Mm.
its empathy, in effect, is not just soft. It is
Mm.
not just sentimental or those kind of things, but it's more like a science. And
Mm.
today it's more like a survival skill. I think it's a very powerful thought which you spoke about. And the other thing which I read about you was that you mentioned that loneliness or chronic loneliness has got the same negative impact on health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Mm.
So I think when we talk about things like empathy, just much more bigger than just categorizing it as one of the key soft skills. So I wanted to put it out there. And
Mm.
second context in today's conversation means that we're talking about empathy in today's day and age, which is, all sort of AI jazz and whatnot, where everybody is thinking more algorithmically, and also,
Yeah.
social media around us, this whole digital age subsumes and consumes us so much that there is very little room sort of left for us to lead in an empathetical manner. So I just wanted to kick off this conversation by understanding what is your worldview in terms of, what does empathy really mean, or how is it evolved as a concept in today's
Mm.
context of super hyper connected digital world, Is digital connectivity really making us more emotionally distant? And what does algorithmic empathy mean to you?
Mm. My gosh. I mean, what a great start, Kartik. Thank you. There's a whole lot in there. Let's start with the soft skill thing. Because every time I stand on stage or get to come and talk to people like all of you, it is one of my big points, which is this is not a soft skill. And you framed that really well at the beginning. In fact, it's a very hard skill, right? So we'll talk about that this evening, but empathy is it's hard to find. You mentioned that, right? We're getting more and more lonely, more and more disconnected. So it's hard to find. It's very hard to sustain, you know. So when I work with leaders, I do a lot of work across India. I just left Mumbai recently. You know, always in the tea break, someone will come up to me and say, Mimi, this is really hard. I'm like, yeah, I know, sir. And you're not alone, you know. So it's hard to find, it's hard to master. But it also has very hard business impact, which is what you were talking about just there in terms of this being strategic. So we know that organizations that have higher levels of empathy are 23% more profitable, 17% more efficient. They see 34% higher levels of output. I could go on and we can talk about that tonight. But fundamentally, I think it's worth starting with what it is. You know, when I'm talking about this not being soft, what is it? So fundamentally, empathy is perspective taking. So this is a data set. You were talking about the algorithmic world, the world of AI. This is human data. This is something that is taught within the FBI, within the armies of the world. We're talking about this as a negotiation skill, something that can overcome conflict in the workplace. This is the ability to understand the people around you. There is nothing soft about it. It is not an emotion. It is not sympathy and should never be confused with compassion. And we could talk about that. But this is the ability to understand other people, to take their perspective. How can you ever motivate performance if you don't understand what motivates people? How can you ever drive double-digit growth if you don't understand the context you're working within, right? So it's something that is built into your prefrontal cortex of your brain. You were born, Kartik, with this, and everybody else has joined us tonight. So probably the question I get asked most is, but Mimi, maybe you just have more empathy than everybody else. But the answer is no. You all have the exact same amount. You, your wife, your brother, your sister, your boss. It is a skill that you can choose to use. So that's how I would start.
Wow, that's an interesting perspective. And I think some of the numbers which you threw, I was taking some notes, are also pretty interesting because we have a huge mix of entrepreneurs on this
Mm.
sort of call as well, and they always get excited when they see, okay, something I'm about to learn is going to lead to some tangible outcome in terms of my P&L, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can see some of them hooked on. But let's build a bit more around. You mentioned that everybody is born with empathy. It's something you choose to use, and it's pretty interesting. I for one didn't know that. I think I always thought that some people are default more empathetic and call me naive, but that's how I understood. But can you sort of help us navigate that? How does somebody, anybody on the call, in fact, understand that what is sort of self empathy and how can they cultivate it? It may be latent, you may not have sort of chosen to use it, to steal
Mm.
your words, but how can you sort of ignite or rekindle it, and any practices around sort of generating or reigniting this empathy, in your daily life and something to do with your personal life as well, because it cannot be that you're empathetic or sort of faking or pretend empathetic in workplace because the numbers make it interesting, but you're not practicing it in your personal life. So how can an individual who's on this call can sort of
Mm.
have some takeaways in practicing empathy in daily life?
Look, I think there's a couple of pieces in there as well. I think that let's first of all just talk about how you can practice empathy in your life generally. Because fundamentally the backbone of empathy is listening. So if you I don't know, Google me, right? You'll see me talking about listening-led leadership. And, you know, if we just start there for a moment and then we can come to our personal lives and ourselves. But fundamentally, there are many, many definitions of leadership and how to lead others. But for me, it's very simple. And the answer is in the name, right, which sits in leading. So to lead, people have to be following you, right? If I'm walking and people are coming, I'm leading them. If nobody is coming, I'm just walking, right? I'm not leading. And what we know is that people follow those that listen to them. So I want to give the audience just a small reflection for them this evening, because it's going to help answer your question as well, which is if you just take a moment, ladies and gentlemen, to think about in your lives, in your personal life, in your business life, three people who listen really well, right? I want you just to think about that. If you feel like writing it down, go ahead. But think of three people in your life that you feel, do you know what, they really listen well. I'm going to give you just like a couple of seconds to reflect on that, and then you're going to see why I'm asking you to do that. When you have those, and I can see some of you like writing, when you have those names, and Karthik, I'm going to come to you as well, right? When you have those names, ask yourself if there's anyone on that list that you do not like, don't respect, or don't want to spend time with, right? The answer's no. And then ask yourself, is there anyone on that list that you do like, you do respect, or you do want to work with? And the answer is yes. And I know that without asking you all individually, because, and thank you, I can see some of you, Biba, sharing in the group, because I do this every day all around the world. The reason I do that, and the more you reflect on it, you'll realize the people that listen to you, the boss that you've had in your life, that listened to you most at work, that gave you value, that really wanted to hear your opinion, was welcoming of your ideas, that's the boss that you stayed late for on a Friday night, right? That's the one you wanted to please. You wanted to follow. So the backbone to all empathy is listening. It's curiosity. Because if you're not asking questions, if you're not open to understanding people, you'll never have the data to lean into their lives, right? So the first piece around how do I become more empathetic? The first thing I would say is awareness. So think about that. How much are you actually listening? And asking yourself one key question. Am I listening to understand, or am I listening to reply? And most of us, most of the time, are listening to reply, right? We're waiting for our opportunity to share your opinion or say, that's not going to fit in my timeline, or I don't have the budget for that, or whatever it is, right? Or in your personal life, you know, I don't want, you know, biryani for dinner. So whatever it is, you're waiting for your chance to answer. But most of the time in our lives, we're running through life without actually listening to understand. So that's one of the key principles, is listening. And of course, when I'm teaching people this, we look at all the micro moments that enable you to be a better listener. And when I talk about listening-led leadership, I mean, everybody is leading someone. So it doesn't matter on the line today when you're in the room, whether you are junior or senior or old or young or an entrepreneur or in corporate or wherever you are leading someone in work, in life, in the community, in the temple, somewhere, right? So if you want to be able to lead others, if you want other people to trust you, to deepen your relationships, the first step is listening. So how does that sound, Karthik, to someone who's interested in this and learning it on a
No, I
Friday?
was just self-reflecting. I think one of the major challenges is the paucity of time. So, like, if
Mm,
let's say I have, I don't know, 10, 12 direct reports as an example, I would want to be like a good listener, but there are also demands on your time.
mm,
And many times, what we fall into is the trap of preempting what a person is going to say because you have like some context and their previous historical data as a context.
mhm.
So, you know, okay, like on this topic, that's what they're going to say.
Yes.
And we all get into this habit of saying, yeah, 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 I know what you're going to say, and then sort of move on because there are other things to be done. So, how do you sort of balance that, paucity of time versus still being a good listener?
And you know what, Karthik, probably one of the number one questions, specifically in India, is that. So whenever I work with Indians across, and I work with you guys every week, somebody asks me that question, because India, more than anywhere on earth, is the country that never sleeps, right? There is
Mm.
pressure and competition and time pressure, arguably more than anywhere on earth. So there's a couple of pieces of that as well. I'd say the first thing is you are right. You are right. To listen, you have to have some time. I can't listen when I'm running out the door, you know? So that is a reality. But it doesn't take as long as you think. So when I do my masterclasses, I often do an exercise with the audience that asks them to listen to it in a partner, in a pair. in under 90 seconds. And we do this exercise. It's normally C-suite, normally executives. And at the end, I ask them not for what they said or what they heard, but the experience of the listening. And often there's people that don't know each other really well. Maybe they're different departments. And I say to them, do you feel that you now know me, better than you did before? And they said, yeah, I had no idea. And I said, that was 90 seconds, right? So this feedback that I don't have time to listen is rubbish because everybody has 90 seconds, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and you touched on this perfectly, is that in so many of our interactions, we enter on assumption or judgment. Like you said earlier, I kind of know what they're going to say, right? But even if you do, that's not the point, right? Because they don't know that you know what they're going to say. And you might be wrong, right? Because things change all the time. So, I often say that when people come into my office, my team, and they have a problem and they're like, Mimi, and the client and the timeline, and they're all stressed. And I don't say anything. I'm like, okay, tell me more about that. Explain to me. All I do is ask questions, right? Maybe 10 minutes later or 6 minutes later, they're like, oh, thank you so much. And they leave. I literally did nothing. They did it themselves because as human beings, whether we like it or not, in the rushed world we work in, we need to be heard. It is fundamental to our humanity. And when you take it away, all kinds of bad things happen to our health, to our well-being, to our performance, to our output, all kinds of things. So whether we like it or not, we have to listen to each other. And when we do, the great news is that there is a reciprocal benefit. So I always teach people that all motivation for humans is relational, right? It's never one way. So when people feel heard, they do better, but actually you do better too. And that can be physiological or from a more functional business point of view, because when they feel heard, there's better levels of impactful risk taking, higher levels of innovation, lower levels of mistakes, higher collaboration. So there's all kinds of, business benefits. So we actually don't have a choice. We have to revert back to what we know as humans, right? What you guys all know as Indians, right? As people that share a country. When I do my workshops, I have a slide that says, this is not a concept, it's a memory. And that's so important, Karthik. I'm not trying to teach you all some mad, new, amazing concept in leadership. What we're talking about is a memory that you all have. You were born doing this. But as you said, the more stressed we become, the less time we perceive that we have, the more disconnected we become as humans. And as I said, that is not beneficial to our businesses, our bottom line, or our families, anyone.
Right. And one of the other things, because we also have in our audience a lot of sort of Gen Z folks, so to speak. And for many of us, baby boomers or Gen X or Y, uh, I think many of us spend a lot of time in non-digital interactions
Mm-hmm.
for a greater part of our life. I'm not saying that sort of precludes that we understand empathy in a metaphysical world in a much better way, but
Mm.
it's a proxy because you sort of spend time, look people eye to eye, have spent a lot of time with them in person, and you've met a range of people in your life. But Gen Z or Alpha, whatever you want to call, they have lived a greater part of their life in a more sort of digital first world, wherein
Mm.
they want to do sort of hangout, Zoom, social media. They make a perception of uh, each other's life with social media as a context or a lens, and they also seem to sort of benefit by being more empathetic as leaders. But without any of their fault, it's just the way they have been sort of brought into this world that they couldn't sort of detach ever themselves digitally and just look at this world in a way probably we saw maybe 20 years ago. What is your advice for digital natives or Gen Z folks? How can they, first of all, is my assumption wrong or hypothesis wrong? Or is empathy means the same for them? There's no
Mm.
difference. If there is, then what sort of playbook would you give to them?
Mm. Look, according to the data, Gen Z already are the most empathetic generation that we've had for 3 generations, right? So our empathy has been declining for 30 years. So we have lost approximately 48% of a skill set. And again, for anyone who joined a bit late, we are talking about a skill set and not an emotion. There is nothing emotional about empathy. There is no emotion in it, in fact, right? This is a functional skill set. And that skill set keeps us alive as a human race. We are literally talking about survival. And we could talk about why, but we are talking about survival. But yes, of course, we're also talking about thriving, right? Getting promoted quicker, having deeper relationships, doing better in work and life, which is more important than ever in the competitive landscape that young Indians, that Gen Z are growing up in. But as I said, the data would show that they are more empathic than any of us, you know. And I believe, and I don't have data for this is just my opinion, but I believe part of that is because they grew up and grew into a world where they had 24/7 access to the woes, the bad things of the entire world around the clock, 7 days a week, right? We didn't, right? And I'm obviously extremely young, but when I grew up, we didn't have social media, right? So we got our news from the television or the newspaper, and that tended to more or less, be about where you lived and where you grew up. You know, you didn't sort of know what was going on, you know, maybe 35 hours away on a plane. So this younger generation have had to watch us make mistakes at scale that have cost us dearly every day of their lives. You know, they grew up, this generation, they grew into the World Trade Centers coming down in New York. All right, that will be one of their earliest memories. They can remember it. If you ask them, they know. They were like maybe 5, right? So they know it, they saw it, and they grew up in a world thinking, what have you lot done? You know, global warming, right? There has never been a world that they have known that is not full of doom and gloom and disaster because it took us that long until we realized we had destroyed our planet, right? So, because of the world they grew up in and that access to media, they are actually more empathic than all of us ever have been. They also have grown into far more capitalist success, and that's not to say we haven't had recessions and things since they've been alive, because of course we have. But they have grown up in a world that was a little bit more successful from a financial terms point of view. So most of them, not all of them, have grown up less, let's say, better off with more financial freedom than their parents had, right? They've grown into that world. Um, so that has meant that they are more empathic, and according to the data, they will continue to trend upwards, which is fantastic news for us. I don't think that the digital world has a lot to do with it, to be honest. When we talk about mainstream, middle of the road, 80% of us, okay? There are, I'm making this number up, but 20%, 30% of the human race who are excessively hiding in a bedroom, gaming 23 hours a day on, you know, World of Warcraft, never socializing and becoming more and more insular because of that. Of course, but that has always been the case, right? Whether they were on games or playing cards, right? They were locked away reading comic books. They were becoming more and more isolated. I don't think social media has fast-tracked the segregation of humanity. It's just shifted it, right? So sometimes CEOs will say to me, Mimi, I just don't understand. Like, why? Why do they need to be on Snapchat? I've asked them not to be on it in the business day, and the minute they have a break, they're back on there. Why can't they talk in real life? And I say to them, well, because when you were their age, you might have gone outside and maybe had a cigarette, right? Maybe they know better, so they're winning, by the way. But you know, you guys went out and maybe you smoked together. The psychology is exactly the same. They are gathering on Snapchat or Instagram or wherever they are. You were gathering on the street having a cigarette and a chai. The reality is the same. They are connecting with their friends. They're making sure they haven't missed out on the gossip or the news of the day. They're not that different, right? The medium changed, but the psychology didn't, because humans are humans. So I'm not sure, to be honest, that the digital revolution will change much. It will just shift how we do that. But of course, we do need to be aware of that, you know, in an AI world, how we balance our humanity with our technology to make that as healthy as possible. But in many ways, it's going to scale this. In many ways, we need tech, we need AI to scale our empathy because we've done such a bad job at it. It's
And
true.
pick on what you said, humans are humans. In the context of, so a lot of us do, business or work internationally.
Mhm.
And one way to look at it is humans are humans. So empathy is like a transferable skill if you're talking to somebody in UK, Australia, India. But is there a context to empathy from a cultural lens or standpoint as well? Or am I wrong in structuring that, empathy could sort of have different connotations in different cultures and contexts? And if it does, then how can one, again, any sort of playbook or any ideas in terms of how can somebody evolve the context of empathy in a different culture or a country?
So I keep saying this, there's multiple parts of that, but there's so many different things we could explore in that. But fundamentally, the first thing I'll say is that yes, different cultures have different innate empathy levels. And nobody has really reported this well, but there's enough sort of social data, as in society's data, to represent that. And what we find is that in collectivist societies, of which most of Asia is, you have higher levels of innate, naturally occurring empathy. And that is because we tend to live in groups. I say we because I have been in Asia for 20 years. My entire adult life has been in Asia. We tend to live in groups. We eat in groups. We live in groups. You're going to see many more multi-generational homes, for example, in India than you are in London, right? Grandma's there, parents are there, grandkids are there, everybody's there, you know? So we live in an environment where understanding each other is more innate. That doesn't mean that we're all using our empathy all the time, but there is a natural opportunity to practice it, right? If you live with your mother-in-law, I'm going to like smile at anyone in this room that lives with their mother-in-law, you know what I'm talking about, right? A lot of times you have to try and work out, why is she doing that? Why is she upset about that? Why does she need me to do this thing, right? That happens all the time. So the first thing is that there is a difference around the world in terms of that collectivist versus individualistic societies, and that does impact our empathy levels. The other thing you were touching on there, Karthik, is kind of cultural norms or cultural understanding. And yes, that too is an area of discussion because, for example, one of the things I teach a lot of is eye contact, particularly in a digital age, and how important that is because when you make eye contact with someone, it actually directly connects with the subconscious brain. And creates connection. It makes people feel safer and more confident, all kinds of things. But in Japan, that's not going to happen, right? In Japan, if I walk into a meeting and make direct eye contact immediately with the chairman, he's not going to like me so much, right? So there are obviously cultural norms around that. You know, in many Western countries, touching is a sign of connection, right? So, like if you, for example, South Africa, I used to live in South Africa for 8 years. When people greet each other, even quite strangers, they hug. They don't even just do that European kiss thing where you touch the cheek, they hug, right? But of course, in many parts of Asia, that would be, and the Gulf. I mean, there's no way you could do that, right? So
You
yes,
could land up in jail.
you could land up in hot water, right? So so how we show that empathy, and you know what's really funny, the last thing I'll say on that is that often after I speak on stage and I come off and there's people, I don't know, getting signatures, whatever they're doing, taking selfies or something, there's nearly always a couple of women somewhere in that line that will say, can I hug you? And I'm like, sure, you can, right? Because for many people, they feel that they just need to sort of solidify that moment that I understood you and you understood me. And people say to me, how do I feel like you could see me and the audience was like 5,000 people? And I said, because I make such an effort. Like even in this webinar, right? And if you watch it back or anyone that's watching tonight, I am so passionately trying to make sure that you know I'm here, right? I can't see you all, but I'm looking at you, I'm smiling at you. I want you to know that I'm in this session with Karthik, with all of you, and that's the only place I am. That's the best I can do to share empathy with a room of, I don't know, 70, 80 people. But those things are culturally connected. And that's why I travel so much for my work, because I think now I just wrote my most recent book, and I talk about it in there, how much like cross-cultural understanding helps you be a better human, basically.
Right. And while you were speaking about these perspectives, I was just wondering, um, what's the ethical angle to empathy? Like,
Mm.
I mean, technically, I mean, it's a longitudinal skill. I could sort of evolve and learn. And if, let's say, somebody is using empathy for a certain kind of persuasion, coercion, in a way which you perceive as empathy,
Mm.
like a simple thing of I sort of make you feel listen, make you feel special, make you feel empathetic, and then I get my way around it. Is
Mm.
there an ethical dimension to empathy, or like empathy is empathy and
Mm.
whatever happens, happens? Or is there sort of any moral fabric around empathy as well?
Mm. My take on that, Karthik, is that there's not an ethical dilemma for empathy. There's an ethical dilemma for humans, right? There are good people and bad people, and there always will be. And we can't change that, So will there be bad people who use these types of skills to create harm? Yes. But there are bad people that use guns to create harm, right? So I think the reality that you're touching on there is just the human condition. There will be bad people that use things to create harm instead of healing or peace or good connections. So I think when it comes to that, it's more about awareness. If you feel, and often that will come across as people call it toxicity, right? Toxic workplaces. If you feel that people are using this, and actually the example you gave when you sort of touched on there, people will try and be really nice to you in order to get their own way. It's fundamentally narcissism, right? And unfortunately, along with Gen Z getting more empathic, the most recent data shows that the percentage of CEOs that show narcissistic tendencies is also up. So there are unfortunately more and more people out there, but it's still in the minority. I still believe that on the whole, we have a lot to be optimistic about. And on the whole, most of us are out here trying to do good work for good reasons. So I don't think it's anything to do with empathy as a skill set. I think it's to do with the people that are using it and the intentions that they have with it.
Right. And fair point. And you have mostly touched upon empathy on a more individualistic level so far. But let's say if somebody on this call, and I know many of them are, is running an organization, so like how can they almost embed empathy into like a system design and
Mm.
not just sort of people? Any thoughts or ideas on that?
Look, I think there's many, many ways to do that. So one of the biggest supporters of empathy within organizations is Satya Nadella, right? He's obviously from your wonderful part of the world, CEO of Microsoft. He has a book. It's called Hit Refresh. And in that book, he talks about empathy 52 times. It's a really good read. It's not a new read. I think it's 2010, but I recommend it to anyone listening. And the reason is because it answers your question. What Satya outlines in there is that empathy is not just for leadership and people and motivation and performance and all those leadership things, but it's for innovation. And we know that when there's higher levels of empathy, you see 68% higher levels of innovation. It is for customer understanding. It is for product development. So yes, there's many ways to embed this skill set of understanding into kind of all areas of your business. I always say there are three phases fundamentally to do that. The first is awareness. So if you want to bring more empathy, more human data, more understanding into your business, you have to be aware that you want that, right? So coming tonight is step one. And for me, thank you, so much for having me, because this is what I live for, right? Every day I have these conversations, whether it's in a webinar like this or live like this, on a stage, in a new book, on a video, right? I do a lot of content on social media to help people understand what this is. The first step is awareness. The second step is intention. So if you want to bring this into your business, you have to intentionally do that, right? It won't happen on its own. So whether that is training or systems or processes or workshops or innovation pipeline shifts or design thinking processes which come from empathy, there are all kinds of ways to intentionally bring it into the business. And the third is accountability, because what you measure manifests. And if you don't measure it, it'll slip away like any other desirable trait, actually, right? It's like going to the gym, right? If you are really good at going every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then you stop for 3 months, it's really hard to get it back, right? So, like any desirable trait, the pattern is really important. The measurement, the accountability is really important. So, awareness, intention, accountability, regardless of where you want to bring it in, those steps will help you.
Right. And I'm also sort of looping in now some of the questions I'm getting from the audience because there are a lot of
Mm.
them, and I don't know at the end whether we'll have time for them or not. One of the interesting questions is because we talk about digital age, AI, and whatnot, that can sort of LLMs, because I know there was a debate earlier as well that LLMs are just sort of vector embeddings, sort of numbers trying to figure out a pattern to ask, also answer your question. Can empathy in some way be modeled into these LLMs or bots which we see like in ChatGPT, Claude, so on and so forth? Is it important? If empathy is not embedded within the LLMs, how does that shape human behavior or society in general? What's your take on embedding empathy within AI systems?
Yeah. No, well, my take is really straightforward. I think we have to, any, let's say, chatbot is only as capable as the people that it's learning from, right? So we have to keep reminding ourselves of that because I think often this AI conversation takes us into like a movie, like, sci-fi world. We are training it, nobody else, right? So it is our responsibility to teach it those things. But the second thing is a comment I kind of made earlier, which is we have to because we are failing. We've already failed, right? If you look at the data out there today, the second biggest killer of our youth, 14 to 24-year-olds, is no longer worldwide. It's no longer vehicle accidents. It's suicide, right? Our children are literally killing themselves because they don't feel that we get them, that they don't belong, right? That's why I talk about survival, right? There are 390 million people with anxiety. There are 334 million people that say they don't have a single friend. So we're failing, right? We need these LLMs, these chatbots, these AI systems to help us bring empathy back in the world. And I often use an example that says, if you ask a very privileged person. If you ask me, right, if I would like my daughter, she's 7, if I would like to replace all of her school teachers with bots, I'd be like, no, no, like I don't want my child to learn from a bot, right? Because I'm in the privileged position to be able to choose. But if you let's take a young woman in rural India somewhere, right? And she's utterly brilliant and she wants to be a doctor. But her parents still work in fields. They're retiring now, but fundamentally they've worked in the fields in their village all their life. They have no idea what's beyond their town, let alone how their daughter could study enough to become a doctor. She has nobody to ask because nobody else in her village really knows either. But she can go home at night and she can turn on a chatbot, ChatGPT, for want of any of them, and ask ChatGPT in her language, in her context, I really want to be a doctor. And my teacher says I'm really good at science. What should I do? And that bot can say, well, I'm really happy you asked because did you know there's a scholarship program just 2 hours by bus from here? It's going to change her life, right? So we need AI to scale this empathy because we can't. So in many ways, I feel it's not our only hope, but a big part of that hope. So we should stop fearing it and start trying to build it. That's my opinion.
Interesting take. And I'm just going to quickly take that data point you mentioned. And I think somebody also asked that question earlier in the session that if Gen Z is the most empathetic generation, why is it the generation which is having sort of most existential crisis, suicide, so on and so forth?
Mm.
I mean, they should be inversely correlated, yeah.
Well, I think it would depend on what we think that existential crisis is, so that we be a little bit more specific around what it is that we're referencing. Because I think that in all generations, we think that it was harder for us or that it's different for them, but it very rarely is, right? So I think that the challenges change with every generation. But whether those existential crises are any, I don't know, bigger necessarily for them, I don't have that data. But what we do know is that their ability to connect to others, to care, no, it's not always about care, but in this case, I'm going to talk about that, to care for the planet, for the people around them, for their ecosystem, to want to fix. That mindset is shifting. And even as I said, my little girl, she's 7, so she's another generation and a half behind. But I'll give you a reference point. For her, we live in Malaysia, and she's only ever lived in Asia. She's an entirely Asian child. And when she sees litter on the road, and I haven't brought her to India, so that will be a shock, right? But when she sees like a can of Coca-Cola, for example, on the ground outside, she'll say, I mean, she'll look at me and she'll say, I don't understand. Why would somebody put that there? I say, well, some people litter, but it's like I'm speaking a foreign language. She's like, but why, mummy? Why would they do that? And I'm like, it's a big question, right? But her sense of community, her sense of protection of the we, not the me, is something I've never seen, So that ability to connect to others and to be part of a wider group, and that's, you see that more and more now with the amount of community work that's being done. You cannot turn on LinkedIn without reading about another community, right? A CMO community, a leadership community, any community, right? I read yesterday that there are 3 community groups in the world that are worth over $1 billion. They're just community groups, right? That is how much people are looking to reconnect. So I think it's shifting quite fast.
Very interesting. And also tell me, like somebody like you, who sort of advocates around empathy, practices empathy, do you do you have to consciously work on improving empathy as a skill, or does it like become a second nature, or do you uh, lose it if if you don't practice it? Like how do you sort of preserve that? Um, it's a skill you mentioned. So do you need to sort of work on the skill, or because somebody also mentioned that like pretentious empathy is not empathy, because if you're consciously working on empathy, trying to be more empathetic, it might appear pretentious or even fake to others. So what's the fine line in terms of cultivating that skill but not sort of overdoing it?
I think it comes down to intention, right? As I said earlier about, good people and bad people, I think if you intentionally want to understand people, you will. That is fun. It's just it's like being polite, right? If you believe that you're a polite person, you believe in respecting others and saying thank you when somebody holds the door open for you, you are, right? Because that's who you are. That's what you believe in the world. So I think for me, listen, is it natural to me? Yes. To the point that wherever I go, everybody tells me everything, right? Because I'm so good at listening. I'll be in an airport and someone's like, and then, my dog, and I'm like, yeah, yeah, okay, I really have to catch my plane. So yes, it becomes more natural. And of course, I live it every day. But back to the AI point, one of the things that we have to, be true with ourselves about as humans is that we have bad days, right? If I'm extremely unwell, if I have some type of terrible flu and I'm in bed with a fever of 40 degrees, is very hard for me to empathize with anybody because I have to, in the end, you have to make sure that you survive. Whereas an AI bot doesn't get a migraine, right? So for them, again, arguably they can sustain it even better than the people that really do it by a day-to-day basis. So, but I think at large, it comes down to intention. If you are using empathy because you genuinely want to understand people around you, yes, because it's going to grow your business and make them perform better, but you genuinely believe in that because of who they are, because of who you are, I don't think you need to worry about the line.
Interesting. And also, you mentioned in our conversation that it can also lead for you to have better, not just business benefits, but in personal life, it can also, improve your physical, mental health. And we had a couple of questions around that. Do you want to delve into a little bit of detail, like what kind of wellness outcomes can one hope for if they have more empathy embedded into their personal lives?
Mm. So fundamentally, and you touched at the very beginning, Karthik, on the loneliness epidemic. And I think you quoted this, if I remember, 40 minutes ago.
15 cigarettes or something, yeah,
There we
exactly.
go. Yeah, yes, exactly that, right? So, according to the Surgeon General in the USA, to be chronically lonely is as dangerous as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So, our loneliness is quite literally killing us. It is also the highest cost to our healthcare systems worldwide. So, the highest cost today globally is not cancer or heart disease or diabetes, it is actually disconnection. As human beings, we are meant to be together. We are a pro-social species. So if you go back to tribal times, right, we knew when we lived in tribes in the jungle, if somebody got separated from the tribe, either they died or we did, depending on their role, right? So we knew this always, that we do better than when we're together. The impact of that, and it's, there's a little bit of neuroscience there, but fundamentally the impact of that is that when you are connected with others, you have a calmer neurological system. What that means is that there are less dangerous hormones running around your body, things like adrenaline, things like cortisol. When you have high levels of adrenaline and cortisol and neocortisol and various other hormones that come into your bloodstream, when they are sustained in the body, because these hormones are meant to come, they have a job to do, namely to help you fight or flight or run away from a problem. But when those hormones are sustained in your body, which they are when you are chronically segregated or isolated or lonely or without others, right? It leads to disease. It leads to issues all across the body. It means that we can't heal as well. So there is data to show that socially connected people heal better from things like cancer. They can get better quicker. We know that the immune system is suppressed for segregated or lonely people. So when you don't feel that you fit in at work, you will find you actually get sick more, right? So if you have very high levels of flu and absenteeism due to illness in your office, you might question actually what's really causing this. Is it the, in KL at the moment we have terrible smog. Is it the pollution, right? Or is it humanity, right? Why are my people so sick all the time? So there are very real drivers of well-being, social well-being. And in fact, my brand new book that comes out in October in New York is called The Connection Prescription. And that book is about this. That book is about why it is that empathy, belonging, actually helps us survive, right? Because you can do as many triathlons as you want, or you can put as many fruit bowls in the office as you like. If you are chronically isolated, statistically, you will die 8 years earlier than another. And according to the World Health Organization, and this data, Karthik, is brand new, it came out 2 weeks ago, currently we are losing 900,000 people a year to loneliness. So there is a very, very direct link between our health, our survival, and our empathy.
Interesting. One of the things you mentioned, I think, a couple of times was around intent. How do you balance? And again, I speak on behalf of many business leaders who are represented in the audience. How do
Mm.
you sort of balance? I don't know what's the right word, but like between empathy and sort of managing business outcome slash justice slash execution. But
Mm.
like somebody who has had the right intent, but sort of the actions or outcomes are not matching with that intent.
Mm.
I mean, to be empathetic would be to sort of understand their intent, but the outcomes and the actions are not coherent to that intent. How do you
Mm.
handle that dilemma while still being an empathetic leader?
Look, I think, again, I think it comes back to intention, but it also comes back to practice. So the last three words of my most recent book, which is called Empathy at Work, and it's out in India. I just launched it in Mumbai a few weeks ago. The last three words of Empathy at Work are practice creates permanence. Because it's a skill set, like any skill set, like riding a bike or playing golf, or whatever you do, whatever you practice, right? You get better the more that you do it. So to your question earlier around my empathy, right? Because I practice it so much, yes, it's more innate. I think if your intentions and your actions are not aligned, there's only two ways to fix that. One is through that intentional awareness and saying, do you know what? I think I'm listening really well, but my wife doesn't agree, right? You have to have, you're laughing because I use it because people tell me all the time, right? With husband and wife, it happens all the time. You have these arguments, often the woman, not always, who says, you are not listening to me, right? And you're like, but darling, I am. And she's like, you're not listening, right? You think you're doing it, but your actions are showing otherwise, right? So there is an awareness around that. But the latter part is then practicing to fix it. Because if, and try this, right? Ask your husband, wife, somebody tonight, do you think I'm a good listener? Try and get an honest answer. And then find out why they think that, and that practice is a practice. So I'll give you an example. I had a CEO, I write about him in the book actually a few years ago, global CEO, and he had this habit when he was on calls, especially phone calls, of going, uh-huh, uh-huh, mm-hmm, uh-huh, uh-huh, mm-hmm, uh-huh, the whole way, right? He thought that that made it feel like he was listening. But of course, as the listener, you're like, he literally doesn't care, right? He's probably reading an email, right? So his actions and his intentions were not aligned. But I think it takes some awareness to come to realize that. And that is why, back to my comment earlier, in so many of like the tea breaks of my masterclass sessions, senior men come to me and go, they say two things, can't they? They say, this is really hard. But they also tell me often, they say, Mimi, I just realized I've never listened to anybody in my whole life. Right? It happens all the time. I always laugh. I say, don't worry. People tell me that all the time, right? Because so often we run through life and we think we're listening. And this does skew to men. There is, by the way, no gender difference. So women and men, we have the same amount of empathy. And in fact, many of the best empathetic leaders are men. There is no gender balance. But having said that, just from my experience, it tends to be men that more often say to me, I don't think I've done this for years, Mimi. I'm like, it's okay. There's still time.
I'm gonna ask you a counter question, a counterintuitive question. Is there something which is like over empathy? Like, can you overdo it?
Yeah.
And if yes, like, when do you know that you're overdoing it, and what's the danger?
Mm. No, I don't think so. I often get asked similar versions of that question. I don't think so. I don't think there's any such thing as too much data, right? Too much understanding. You can choose how you use it, right? So what you do with that. And of course, as a leader in any position, at some point we have to move from understanding to action, right? So at some point you have to take that understanding and make a decision. But no, I don't think there's such a thing as too much data, too much understanding. The better you know your competition, the better you can compete, the better you understand your clients, the better you can frame your payment terms, the better you understand your staff, the more likely you are to motivate them, the better you understand your wife, the more likely you are to stay married. So no, I think there's no such thing as too much understanding.
And also, probably the last question in the interest of time. Um, with like in many countries, I'm reading now. I haven't seen firsthand, but many countries now you have humanoids and human workers as colleagues.
Mm.
They are trying with this workplace, especially like South Korea and some other countries. How do you foresee that? Like, imagine having two humans and a humanoid in a boardroom or a meeting room. How does empathy look like? I don't know, 5 years, 6 years down the line when we have a co-working arrangement between human agents and AI.
Mm. What I know, I don't have the magic crystal ball, so I can't tell you the answer. But what I do know is that we can empathize with anything, right? So if you remember, there was a movie, I can't remember, but it was Tom Hanks, and he's stranded on an island and he makes friends with his volleyball. I can't remember the movie. If anyone knows it, put it in the chat box. But that is an example of this, right? In that movie, the character Tom Hanks, he's stranded on a desert island and he has nobody. So he finds a volleyball, and if I remember rightly, he puts a face on it and he names it. It's like Winston or something. And the movie is actually in a large part about his relationship with this volleyball. So we can show empathy
That's the way.
to, yes, that's it. We can show empathy to anything. We show empathy to animals, we show great empathy to all kinds of animals. Um, there is also lots of studies, and in those same countries, in Japan and Korea, and it's really interesting. You should Google it. They're really sweet. There are studies where lonely people and they're not allowed pets, or they can't have pets, have very realistic pets that are actually robots, basically, like a bunny rabbit
In
that
Japan, they do, I've seen.
and South Korea, right? And they breathe and they move and they twitch and they learn because they're backed with some type of learning system. And people believe they're real. There's other examples. I sometimes show them on my keynotes of basically like an Alexa device, fundamentally an Alexa device for the elderly that's been developed in Asia. And it's a learning version of Alexa. And so it helps the elderly feel less lonely. So when they come back, the Alexa device, it's got another name, but it will say, "Oh, hello, Dorothy, how was bridge tonight? Are you still going to make chicken?" And it learns how to engage. And Dorothy builds a relationship with basically Alexa, right? So what I do know is that our empathy is unending. We can apply it to anything that has some form of reciprocal relationship with us. So it won't matter in 6 or 16 or 60 years whether you're sitting at lunch with, fellow humans or some type of humanoid that is engaging with you on a human level. You will be able to feel the same between them, which makes us miraculous, actually. And it always makes me wonder that if we are capable of such love and respect, how it is possible that our world is full of the other side of it as well. So that gives me great optimism. There is so much hope, there is so much hope for a better world and a more connected world. So I'm really excited to see how it goes.
It's been fun chatting with you, Mimi. I think we're just out of time. I'm just got a thing from the organizing team. But I've been taking notes for myself as well, and I'm sure when I go back to work on Monday, I have lost people probably are gonna see a slightly improved version of me, slightly more empathetic, and I'll practice on weekend with my wife in personal life as well to be a better listener. But I've just made some notes for everyone as a takeaway. First of all, it's not a soft skill, it's a hard skill. It takes time. You got to work at it. If you do work at it, it's not just going to add years to your life, but also life to your years. But more importantly, in your business, 23% more profitable, 17% more efficient, and a host of other benefits. So it's worth investing in for those of you who always care about why should I care about it. You should care about it. And then she put it very simply that empathy is just the ability to understand people around you, and it's helpful in every context, whether you are negotiating, buying an asset, or doing business, or even in personal life, navigating through conflicts, conversations, disagreements. And the backbone of empathy is listening, and listening to sort of understand and appreciate the context and perspective of the other person, and not just listening to speak the way most of us do. And also, if you want to know more, she has written so many books. I made some notes, Empathy at Work, you can check out. And the next book is coming in October, Connections Prescribed.
Yes, Connection Prescription. Yes, and my publisher is in Mumbai. So, well, I have two. I have one in the US and one in Mumbai. So I will come and launch it with all of you.
Awesome. We can't wait to welcome you again next time you're in India. It's been such a pleasure and honor And really one of those conversations, because most of the things I do maybe in my professional life is talk about tech, AI. Personally, I've benefited a lot from this 1 hour of conversation, and I'm taking away a lot. So thank you so much on a personal level, but thanks to AIMA and Young Leaders Council, especially for giving all of us an opportunity to learn and listen. We muted them, so that's why they are listening, not to listen.
They're forcefully being having to listen.
Empathy. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Karthik. You've been a phenomenal host, and to everyone that came and joined us and shared your Friday with us, and all the questions there. And I have just said in the chat box, please, if I didn't answer your question, do just copy and paste it over to Instagram or LinkedIn, and I over the weekend I will answer everybody personally. And to Ima, thank you. I knew this would be a wonderful conversation, and it absolutely was. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Mimi. We hope to see you soon in person and host you. And thank you everyone for joining in. Have a great weekend.